Hey guys, I hope spring break went well and that you had a good review yesterday and that we're all ready to get back to work. I'm going to try using a pre-recorded lecture on Zoom instead of using the Google Drive. Everybody was having a little bit of trouble with that, so we'll see if I can awkwardly make you a video lecture today instead of just plain audio. I miss y'all, hope y'all are doing well, but we're going to start talking about the Aztecs today, and I'm going to share my screen with you, so give me just a second. The Aztec Empire began around, well, the Aztec tribes, we know about them, it's starting from about 1200 AD. If you remember the Maya Empire that we studied last semester, they started to crumble around 700 AD. And then around that time, the Toltecs came in and took over and introduced human sacrifice and kind of changed their culture a bit. Toltecs established the city of Chichen Itza, which was technically a Mayan city, but it had all the Toltec influences. The Toltec capital fell around 1200 AD, and that led the whole Central America to just be a bunch of city-states that were continuously warring. It was a huge amount of civil unrest. None of them could unite or form alliances. They couldn't agree on anything for more than a few years at a time. And it was a really valuable area of land to live, but it was almost impossible to have peace or be successful or create a civilization that would last. So into this unrest were some nomadic tribes traveling, and they came from North America. According to legend, the Nahua people began as a group of 7 Native American tribes who lived in 7 caves, which were their tribal home. Later on, they moved to the city of Aztlan, which lay somewhere nearby. Now, Aztlan is the root of the word Aztec that we have now. They may have been somewhere just north of the Valley of Mexico. Well, some people believe they may have been as far away as the Pacific Northwest. The name Aztec does come from Aztlan, which was the Nahua's long-lost, mysterious homeland. And if you see the picture on the slide here, this is an actual Aztec painting of what they believed the Aztlan 7 caves to be. And there's a bunch of myths and legends related to that, just like with every culture that we've talked about so far. Later still, those 7 tribes of the Nahua left Aztlan and began migrating southward in search of a new home. Their story does not tell why the Nahua left Aztlan, but a natural disaster, such as a drought or an erupting volcano, may have damaged their homeland and driven them south. One by one, the migrating Nahua tribes all discovered the Valley of Mexico and decided to make this moist, fertile valley their home. So the last of the 7 tribes to arrive in the valley would be the Mexica. Because they were last and all of the other tribes had established themselves, they were given the worst piece of land. It was all that was left. The Tapanecas were the tribe that allowed them to settle, and they gave them a rocky, inhospitable hill called Chapultepec, which stood just west of Lake Texcoco. The Mexica made part of their living by fighting for the Tapanecas for their wars. So basically, they're mercenaries. They were allowed to settle in this rocky, hilly area in exchange for their service in the wars against all the other tribes. 50 years later, around 1300, warriors from the nearby city-state of Culhuacan, and these are Toltec, captured and conquered the Tapanecas. And so the Mexica began to fight for the Culhuacans instead. By winning victories for them, the Mexica began to grow in power and prestige. So now the Mexicas, who are the Aztecs, instead of serving their fellow tribesmen, are serving the Toltecs, who came in and conquered, but are gaining some renown and prestige. They actually have some importance and some value. In 1323, the Mexicas' growing prestige earned them a chance to form a permanent alliance with the Cajucans. To seal this alliance, the Cajucan king arranged a wedding between his own daughter and the Mexica's chief. At this wedding, the Mexica began to reveal the depth of their savagery. So the Aztecs, you're going to notice, are very different than a lot of the other Middle American cultures. All of Mesoamerica was kind of violent and depraved. They all had art, to some degree, many of them had systems of writing, which we've explored with the Mayan Empire. But the Aztecs were a step above. I mean, they were brutal, violent. Even when they were wandering nomads, they were very different. So the Mexica's chief saw this prestigious wedding to the Princess of Cahocan as a chance to please his god, who was the war god. For this reason, instead of honoring the princess as a symbol of his new alliance with Cahocan, the chief decided to honor his savage god by sacrificing his bride to him. The Mexica may have believed that the sacrificed princess could become a star, like one of their god's brothers or sisters, or they may have believed that she would become a goddess. But whatever they believed, when the king arrived for his daughter's wedding ceremony, he was horrified, aggrieved, and disgusted to learn that Mexica had murdered his daughter in the most brutal way imaginable, which was removing her heart. Not content merely to murder her, the Mexica had also skinned her, and a Mexica priest appeared at her wedding ceremony wearing her skin as a robe. Naturally, the king of Cahocan was irate over his daughter's murder, and after the failed wedding, the once honored warriors of the Mexica had to flee from the king's wrath and run for their lives. It was at this moment that the Mexica received an important sign from Huitzilopochtli, their god. So, 1325, and in their desperation to find a new home, the Mexica turned to Lake Texcoco itself, where they lived along the banks on that rocky hill. They traipsed the lake's shores and searched its marshy islands, looking for a place where they could be safe from the king's wrath. Finally, on one of these islands, the Mexica saw an unusual sight that seemed like a vision from heaven. A golden eagle stood perched on a prickly cactus, eating a serpent that it clutched in its talons. To the Mexica, the serpent-eating eagle was a long-awaited sign from their god. The priest told them that Huitzilopochtli had sent the eagle to mark the spot that he had chosen to be their permanent tribal home. The boggy island where that prickly pear cactus grew became the center of the Mexica's new capital city, Tenochtitlan. And we're going to talk about the building of Tenochtitlan. Give me just a second to move this out of your way. Okay. So, the Mexica built their new tribal home city of Tenochtitlan on a marshy island in western Lake Texcoco. By carrying in earth and rock from the mainland, they gradually filled their island's low spots and expanded it until it was large enough to hold a city that could house tens of thousands of people. They connected their island city to the mainland with 3 wide causeways, which were elevated roads that they built by filling in that lake with earth and rock. And each causeway, they left gaps through which boats could pass. They spanned these gaps with wooden bridges that they could remove whenever their enemies threatened the city. The Mexica began building Tenochtitlan around 1325, and as long as their empire survived, they never stopped building. The mightier the Mexica became, the more they added on to their city. When the temples that they built had begun to seem small, they built larger ones on top of them. They expanded Tenochtitlan until it was large enough to be a fitting capital for their Aztec Empire, which was to become Middle America's greatest empire. So even today, as archaeologists are digging into these temples and uncovering racks of skulls and other horrifying things and amazing art, they're discovering all of these different levels of history and how they built up and how each period during this empire was a little bit different. Near the center of Tenochtitlan was its sacred precinct, which you can kind of see in these pictures. This was the Aztecs' most important center of worship. A high wall called the Serpent Wall set the sacred precinct apart from the rest of Tenochtitlan. Within the Serpent Wall stood several temples that were similar to the ones that the Maya built. The greatest of these was the Templo Mayor, a double temple with a shrine for Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, on the right, and a shrine for Tlaloc, the god of water, on the left. Templo Mayor stood in the very spot where the Mexica had seen the sign of the eagle perched on the prickly pear cactus. Other important temples honored Quetzalcoatl, who you'll remember from the Maya, the feathered serpent god, and the sun. Among other things, this sacred precinct also held a special place for the Aztec priests to live, a large rack on which these priests displayed some of their many victims' skulls, and a Tlachtli court for the Mesoamerican ball game. So this sacred precinct that you see in the middle of your city here was actually a compound where a lot of events would happen. So I want to talk about their farming. So another unique part of Tenochtitlan was how they raised their food. Remember, they're living on a boggy, marshy island in the middle of a lake. They are removed from the mainland. They can't really get back and forth to grow their crops on the mainland, and they don't have enough land on their island to grow their crops. So they developed something that the Toltecs had already begun to use to a small degree called chinampas. The Mexicans, the Mexica, used the Lake Texcoco as a place to build farms as well as cities. In shallow areas of the lake, Mexica farmers piled layers of earth and old vegetation on the lake bed, filling the lake to create raised gardens known as chinampas. They built their chinampas with canals between them and used boats to move from garden to garden. These lake-watered gardens were so warm and moist that farmers could harvest crops from them 4 or more times a year. In order to raise so many crops per year, the farmers had to raise seedlings and more mature plants at the same time. While the first crop was growing, the farmers planted seeds for their second crop on smaller plots. And while their first crop was ripening, the farmer's second crop was growing into seedlings. After they'd harvested the first one, they transplanted the seedlings from the smaller plots so they could grow on the big plots to full size. So they continuously had new vegetation growing, and they rotated their crops across different chinampas so they wouldn't use up the soil. To find small plots where they could start their seedlings, the farmers turned again to Lake Texcoco. They wove mats out of reeds, floated them in the lake, and spread layers of soil over them. Then they planted their seedlings on these floating reed seed beds. The canal boats would pass from one chinampa to another, and frequently they were large enough for a small hut in a family garden. And there's a city just south of Mexico City now that has preserved many of these chinampas. It's called the Floating Gardens. And if you have time, it'd be fun to look that up. It's a pretty unique place, and they've really maintained it well, and they still grow vegetables and plants there and live off of it. So the chinampas were the floating gardens divided by canals. Now, the Aztecs rose to power. Remember, they established themselves in Tenochtitlan around 1325. It took time to develop what they were achieving. But finally, the Aztecs became a great power by taking over the 3 cities that surrounded their island city. They did so by helping one city in her war against another city, and then suddenly changing allies in the middle of the war. After defeating these former allies, the Aztecs demanded tribute in the form of food, clothing, weapons, and other things the growing city needed. When the Aztecs began receiving yearly tribute, their soldiers were relieved of their farming duties, making them available to fight. 2 other cities, Texcoco and Teotihuacan, formed a league with Tenochtitlan. So now we have a united front of 3 cities who are working together. And remember, this has not happened in Mesoamerica in a long time. As the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan became more powerful, these cities became subject to Aztec rule, and their kings served as slaves to the Aztec emperor. By the 1500s, Aztec territory stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf coasts and southward to the border of present-day Guatemala. There were 38 provinces that sent yearly tribute to the Aztec capital. Many of these tribute cities were allowed to keep their former kings, but these rulers could not be trusted, and so Aztec soldiers were put in place in the city. Soldiers who received such a post received it as a reward for bravery. The cities paying tribute had to provide the Aztecs with both soldiers and a yearly quota of goods. Cities continually rebelled, however, by refusing to send tribute. The Aztecs then sent soldiers to put down the rebellions, and thus the Aztecs became a soldier society, leaving all of the work to the people that they conquered. So they went from being this innovative, hardworking, although violent and hard to understand civilization, but seriously, they went and took this marshy island and turned it into this amazing, flourishing city, to bringing in all the slaves to do the hard work and becoming empiristic and soldier society based. Let's see. Next, we're going to talk about their customs. And if you are following along in your outline, which I highly recommend you do, I have bolded most of what information needs to go in that. In future, we'll work towards practicing not having bolded words in your slides, but we're going to continue to do that while everything's kind of unsettled here and we're still adjusting to working at home. So the Aztec customs, they were very strict, and basically their days were divided into sections by the government, by whoever was in charge of that section of the city. So the morning would begin with the blowing of a conch shell and the beating of drums. The sounds indicated to all in ear range that the day had begun. Women would begin cooking, men would go take their steam baths and tend to their allotted fields or their soldier work. By 10 a.m., the conch shells were blown again to indicate that it was time for a mid-morning meal for the farmers. Later in the day, when the blaring of the conch shells again, men would gather for their largest day of the meal while sitting on mats around the hearth. Women were respected but ate separately. Children played with pull toys on wheels, although the wheel was not used for carting things or grinding grain. Heavy loads were carried on a person's back. So the Aztecs are one of the few civilizations in America that had the wheel, but they didn't use it for work. They only used it for toys. As far as we can tell, and archaeologists have discovered, there are no tools that contain the wheel. Besides fresh fruits, vegetables, and lots of hot chilies, the diet of the Aztecs revolved around the items that are commonly found in a lake, such as fish, frogs, snails, worms, turtles, and snakes. Food was strictly portioned out to children according to their age. For example, a 3-year-old child received 1/2 of a maize cake or a tortilla a day. A 4 to 5-year-old received 1 whole tortilla, and a child between 6 to 12 years old got 1.5 maize cakes, and those 13 got 2, and there was no asking for seconds. Speaking of children, Aztec kids were expected to work hard at home and at school. By the age of 3, they were given small chores. If the chores weren't done, a child might be pricked with cactus needles, held over a fire of hot chili peppers, or left tied up in a mud puddle overnight. Laziness just wasn't tolerated. Poor boys went to school to learn to fight and farm. Rich boys went to learn history, astrology, how to interpret dreams, as well as how to become strong warriors. Though the rich had more opportunity, they were also expected to be more disciplined. Rich boys were expected to give blood offerings in school and ritually bathe in frigid waters and fast on a regular basis. Bravery was seriously valued by both the rich and the poor. When a young man captured his first prisoner in war, he was allowed to cut off a long lock of his own hair from the back of his head. He was then free to quit school and advance in society. Remember, they are now a soldier-based society, so any hope of a future was based on your ability to capture slaves or kill. He was never allowed to hold an office if he had failed to capture anyone in war, and he was left with an embarrassing long strand of hair. He was also forbidden to wear finer clothes. There was little tolerance for cowards. At the end of the school day, young men had the freedom to take special baths, paint their bodies, and sing and dance into the night, even as late as midnight. Noblemen played a difficult game of basketball called tlachtli, much like the sport created by the Maya. Without being able to use their hands, it was hard to make a basket. It was so hard to make a basket that the game was over after just 1 point was scored. A board game called patoli was similar to checkers and was enjoyed by all. Men were usually married by age 20 to girls about 16 years old. Marriages were arranged by a local matchmaker and sealed by a ceremony that included tying the young groom's cape to his bride's blouse. Oddly enough, the bride's arms and legs were often adorned in red feathers. Again, the conch shell sounds in the evening, while women are kept busy sweeping, weaving, and embroidering. They also would shop in markets that would hold up to 60,000 people. Before nightfall, men sharpened their farm tools and worked on their homes. A commoner's house was made out of mud and dirt with a dirt floor and no windows, but wealthier families had adobe-style homes made from sun-dried clay or bricks or stones. The homes were then painted white, and they had several rooms neatly arranged around an inner garden. The Aztec day ended with yet another blowing of the conch shell and the beating of drums. The sounds summoned the priests to prayer and everyone else to bed. By the time the day was over, the conch shell was blown up to 9 times to dictate exactly what a person ought to be doing. There was no choice. That's just the way of life for the Aztecs. And if you all studied ancient history, you might relate this to the Spartans training and how the women and men would train differently and had rigid schedules where there was no varying and strict food allowances. Besides following a strict regimen of time, the Mexica followed a strict dress code. Each of the 3 classes of the society had its own style. The nobility, or pipitlin, wore long, soft capes made of cotton that fastened in a knot at the neck. I tried to include some images here, they're hard to see. Their capes were embroidered with their military achievements. Sandals, which were worn only by nobility, were decorated with turquoise and gems. Jewels and gold bands were worn on arms and anklets. Men pierced themselves just below the lower lip. Everyone seemed to pierce his or her ears, but only a king could pierce a turquoise stone in his nose. Elaborate feather headdresses were a sign of great accomplishment, especially if they came from the word quetzal, a beautiful bird that was sacred to the Aztecs and Maya and is considered endangered today. Commoners wore a shorter, coarse clothing made from the fibers of a cactus, not the prickly part, of course. It was forbidden for their tunics to hang longer than their ankles. The penalty for violating that rule was death. Slaves, the Tlacotin, made up the third class, and they wore the shortest and most uncomfortable clothes of all. All men wore a loincloth called a maxtli that wrapped around their waist and came up between their legs and tied in the front. And there's an image of that in your picture there too. Women's hairstyles varied according to their status. A single woman wore her hair long and hanging down. A married woman wore her hair up, usually in two wrapped braids that ended on the side of her head. So now we get to the most interesting part and the most horrific part, human sacrifice. In case you're wondering how historians know all these details about the lives of the Mexica, it has to do with the detailed records that they kept. As strict as they were about everything else, you should have expected this. The Aztecs used hundreds of symbols and drawings to capture great details of their history in books called codices, very similar to the Mayans. Move this out of the way. The scribes used brightly colored paints or on deerskin or tree bark paper that folded like an accordion. These books contain prayers, speeches, tax codes, and how children ought to be disciplined. More of these would exist, except that some Aztec kings burned their early history books to hide their brutal customs from others. Even so, as outsiders like the Spanish moved into Mexico late in the 1500s, they discovered the unbelievable atrocities of human sacrifice done by the Aztecs. In turn, the Spanish also destroyed many of the codices as if to erase what had happened there. I suppose you can hardly blame the Spanish explorers for being appalled at the Aztecs. As they grew in number, the Aztecs seemed to create war just for the sake of taking prisoners whom they could sacrifice to their sun god. In all likelihood, there were times when 10,000 to 80,000 people were sacrificed in a single ceremony by Aztec priests. It was recorded that at one religious festival, it took 4 straight days of killing for the priests to finish their tasks. So these beautiful multi-level pyramids shining white in the sun were scenes of horrific sadness. Though food and marigolds were sometimes offered to the gods, in most cases priests offered the heart of their victim to the sun god at the highest point of their steep temples. They then collected the skulls of the dead on racks. Sometimes cannibalism was part of the ceremony. The belief behind the sacrifices was that without them, the sun would cease to shine and bring death to all. From this distorted practice of killing, the Mexica grew in power. For 200 years, they dominated surrounding tribes and most of Mexico through absolute fear. To stay alive, the tribes around them eagerly paid tribute, making the Aztecs one of the richest empires of that era. That is, until the Spanish invaded. If you think about it, the Aztecs were, in a way, familiar with the biblical concept that the wages of sin is death. And the other scripture that says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. They seemed to understand that sacrifice was needed for redemption. Imagine their joy and relief when they later learned from the Spanish that Jesus Christ had paid the penalty for their sins with his divine blood and substituted his perfect life for theirs. Had they grasped the gospel earlier in history, they would not have needed to spill the blood of so many thousands of humans on an altar. And that's a perfect lesson following up on Easter for us. So hopefully you've been following along with your quizzes, with your outline. I wanted to share one more thing. If you notice, the Mexican flag has a prickly pear cactus with a golden eagle eating a serpent on it. They took that symbol from the Aztecs and made it part of their heritage. I think that's kind of fascinating. So that's all I have for you today. Tomorrow you are going to next 2 days, you're going to have a couple of worksheets that kind of go into a little bit more of the floating gardens, their games, how they made their red dye, which was with a beetle. And there's one other worksheet to read, and you'll fill out some answers on it and do a few sketches for me. And you'll turn those in next Tuesday. Thursday, I hope you all can sign in. We're going to have a live Zoom review. I'm going to check in and say hi to everybody, see how you're doing, and actually see your faces. And then we will do a review of everything that's on our unit guide. So have your unit guides ready and log in. We'll try to start at our normal class time of 1 o'clock, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone. Let me know if you have any problems or any questions, and see you later.